Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today started the Tata Steel Chess Tournament. We will have coverage every day of the tournament. If you're not too familiar, one of the biggest tournaments of the year has 14 of the top players in the field. We have 9 of the top 15 players in the world playing, including the top 3 players in the world. 2 of those are actually up against each other in round 1 that we're going to be covering. White is played by Magnus Carlsen, the #1 player in the world. He got second in this tournament last year, looking to get back on the winning track. In 2016, he got first. 2015, he got first. Decided to take off 2014, but 2013 he got first. So wants to get back into winning this tournament year after year. His opponent, the second-ranked player in the world, and that is the American Fabiano Caruana, just coming off winning the London Classic in December. So he's playing hotter than anyone right now, and this could be a potential future match of the World Championships. As you may know, we have the Candidates Tournament coming up in March, and Fabiano Caruana will be one of those competitors to try to win the Candidates Tournament and play Magnus Carlsen in November for the World Championship. But we'll go ahead and get into it with Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. Magnus starts out with his normal e4 move, responded pawn e5, and knight f3, and this is where right away things get a little interesting with knight to f6. We just don't see this very often. I'm not sure if Magnus Carlsen was expecting to see this. I do like the approach from Caruana. He knows Magnus Carlsen wants to come out the gate. This is one of his favorite tournaments, and so he wants to come out early, especially with the white pieces. Magnus tries to be extremely aggressive, and this can many times throw your opponent off. You just don't see knight to f6 played after your opponent starts out with pawn to e4, knight to f3. I don't know how many aggressive lines Magnus Carlsen has to counter this, but my guess is he's not nearly as prepared for this particular tournament as he would be against the Berlin defense, which we see many times when we're seeing that knight to c6 and then getting into the Rai Lopez Berlin defense from there. But Magnus Carlsen continues knight to e5. This is the classical variation. And then pawn to d6. Much better move than the knight coming and taking here on e4. If you're not too familiar, I do have a video on the Petrov defense. You can go and watch that if you're curious why pawn to d6 even makes sense. Pawn to d6, and then the knight comes back here to f3. Now, this is 2 of the top players in the world. Myself, one of the moves I like to play when I come across this is knight takes on f7. Definitely not the most sound move, but depending on who my opponent is, this is a fun way to play chess, especially if you have a fast clock. Your opponent plays king to f7, and you can just chase their king around for a good bit of the game, and I think you can have a extremely strong game from white. It's very difficult for black to really hold on to this. Top level play, that's absolutely going to be a mistake. Magnus Carlsen brings his knight back here to f3, and the knight takes on e4. Both sides are equal in material, so there's a couple ways that Magnus Carlsen can respond here. Just completely avoid the knight on e4 and continue pawn to d4. This is the most common we see. You could say knight to c3. If you want to exchange, that's fine. Opens up. Completely okay to have double pawns here. Both these bishops are ready to go, where you can see even this pawn on d6 is blocking the star square bishop for Caruana. So that's another option. Or you could just decide, let's go ahead and be aggressive. Bishop to b5 check. But he decides to play queen to e2. It doesn't matter if he plays pawn to d3 or queen to e2. Both of these are going to block the light square bishop. So eventually, Magnus Carlsen will need to move this so he can get his light square bishop involved into the game. Queen to e7, stopping that does a little bit tricky if you try to hold on to it with pawn to f5. So decides to take the better approach with queen to e7. Pawn d3, forcing the knight to move. Knight comes back here to f6. Knight up here to c3, continuing development, and then queen down here to e2. So both sides seem to be okay getting their queen off the board, especially in the Petrov defense. The queen's coming off generally ends in a drawish game. But with these two, you're never really sure. Play continues with pawn to g6, getting ready to fianchetto his bishop here to g7. Control these dark diagonal squares in the center of the board. Knight to d4. Pawn to a6, wants to make sure that if the knight comes to b5, really either of these knights could come here, that black's not forced to play knight to a6. So instead, plays pawn to a6. This does now allow the knight to come freely to c6. d7 doesn't have to worry about a knight coming here to b5 and then up here to c7, which is a very, very painful square for black to deal with. From here, bishop to f4. Magnus Carlsen just continuing his development. Now he can castle on either side of the board, start to get aggressive with his rooks. Bishop here to g7, as we talked about. Pawn h3 just says, okay, I'll just continue. I don't want to commit to one side of the board right now. And this does block you from bringing both your knight here to g4 as well as your bishop here to g4, which you have not gotten involved into the game right now. And you're probably not going to be bringing it to f5 because just the knight can take it right here. So you may see it to just d7 or even e6, which you still might not want to do that if you're not willing to exchange your bishop for the knight. So first move from Caruana after this is bishop to d7. Bishop to f3. We're finally able to get the light square bishop involved after it was blocked by the queen. Then the pawn came up here to d3. It has not been doing too much on the board for Magnus Carlsen. Knight to c3, so pretty much completed development from both sides of the board. Now they can really decide if they want to castle or not. They don't have to. Once the queens come off the board, less likely that sides are going to castle unless they have a good reason to. But the knight takes here on c6 after the bishop takes. Now black has a double pawn in the center of the board. Not always as bad to have a double pawns if you have a pawn connected to it. And what I mean by that is, well, if you have double pawns on the c file, if you have one here on the d file or the b file, not necessarily as bad because the way you can exchange, you end up not having that. If this pawn was not here on the d file, this would definitely be a huge weakness for black. You could almost count this as one and a half pawns, but we're going to go ahead and count it as 2 for now. Castle on the queen side. And then king here to d7. Black has the option to castle on the king side if he wants to, but he looks at it and says, my king here on d7 is pretty safe. Not only have some of the minor pieces come off, a knight and a bishop, the queen's not on the board, but here on d7, my opponent can't even attack me with a light square bishop because it doesn't exist anymore. And so this allows him to control all these pawns right here. This knight's going to not really attack it anytime soon. And so he can play defense mode with his king. It's involved if he ever needs to push forward, and his rooks are freely able to go exactly where they want to. Since it was here on f8, if it did want to control this e file, it would have to move. So since it can freely move over here, king here to d7, much stronger move than try to castle on the king side. Magnus continues with the rook to e1, just controlling that open file. Rook to e8 says, yeah, let's exchange if you want to. You can imagine that Caruana is completely okay going against Magnus Carlsen when Magnus has the white pieces in the first game to come out with a draw. So he's looking to exchange pieces down. He's not playing, you don't play the Petrov defense to get a win. You're trying to confuse your opponent and get to an easy draw game. So that's what we see here. Rook to e8 says, yeah, I don't want you to control this e file, and I'm willing to exchange material on board. Magnus not necessarily ready to do that quite yet. Knight to e4, blocking that. Knight to d5, attacking the bishop. So the bishop comes back here to d2. Pawn f5, forcing the knight to move, and this brings the pawn to h6, just kind of dancing around, forcing Magnus to spend a lot of his energy moving his knights. But at the end of the day, Fabiano Caruana doesn't have any huge threat that Magnus Carlsen has to be worried about. Pawn to g5. This is a few reasons for this move. One, to make sure he's just putting pressure on his opponent, and also he wants to free up this bishop here on g7. This bishop on d2, Caruana always has to be worried about because it can attack and take this pawn on h6. So pawn to g5 says, yeah, I'm going to push forward, and I no longer have to worry about this bishop defending. He can roam free as it needs to now. Pawn to c3. Pawn c5, king up here to c2, just pushing a little bit in the board. Bishop f6, as we talked to. Now I can just get a little bit deeper into position as it wants to. We see an exchange on the board, and now rook to e1 says, yeah, let's go and exchange if you want to. And now Caruana says, yeah, I'm not ready to do that quite yet. I'll bring my rook over here to f8. And so we see rook to h1. Now, if you look at this and you say rook to h1, that's sort of an odd move, but there's not a lot of great squares for Magnus Carlsen to go here. He's not under pressure, but how does he continue? There's not a great square for his bishop. He's not going to bring it back to c1. He's going to lose it to the knight on e3 and f4. He could play pawn to g3. That wouldn't be the worst move. If he wanted to maneuver his knight around, he could play, let's say, knight to g1. And then knight to e2, maybe g3 if he wants to start attacking the pawn here at f5. Fabiano has so much time to respond to that if he wants to. Could on the queen side of the board, pawn to a3 is an option. But he decides rook to h1. And part of that is depending on how Magnus Carlsen continues with some of the exchanges, he could have an attack with his rook here instead of trying to have it on this e-file. Both sides are extremely even in this position. It's tough to see how either side will come out victorious unless someone does make a huge mistake. Rook here to e8, attacking this open file. Pawn to g3, pawn down here. We start to see the knight come back to g1. And then the bishop comes down here to g5. So Caruana being pretty aggressive on board, but then king down here to d1 says, if my bishop's going to move, I need to have a stop for the rook coming down here to e1, which could be a very, very problematic square for white to deal with. Right now, bishop holding down that. So says, yeah, I don't mind an exchange with the bishops, but I do want to hold on to that with my king here on at d1. Pawn to a5, pushing on the queen side. Doesn't have a lot of support on the queen side, but doesn't have much else going on, so decides to start pushing there. Knight to e2, pawn to a4, and then the bishop's exchange on the board, and then after pawn to g4 and recapture, you can start to see what Magnus Carlsen was going for when he played rook here to h1. Now, this is the situation where we have double pawns on the g-file. This is not good for Caruana. You can't really think of this as two pawn moves because they don't support each other in any way, shape, or form. And it's very easy for your opponent to start to attack, especially this pawn behind here on g5. So Magnus Carlsen continues with rook to h5, attacking that. Rook down here, e5, supporting that. Rook h7, check. King to e6. Now the knight here on a d5 is protecting that pawn, so the rook's not going to take it yet. Pawn here to a3, rook to f5, pawn to c4. So this is forcing the knight to move, and this knight is protecting the square here on a c7. But the knight comes up here, attacks on f6, and the rook decides to come back to h2. Not looking to take that material right now. He could have, though. If you're looking and curious, can you take this rook or this pawn on c7? Absolutely can. Just doesn't want to have to worry about his opponent playing rook takes on f2. So that's why in this position decides to bring his rook back here to h2, protecting this pawn. He thinks that's more valuable than taking this pawn back here on a c7, which is double pawn structure on the c-file. He thinks he can attack that later on where he has the better pawn structure. No reason to give your opponent a non-double pawn in exchange for coming down here and wrecking your second rank here, which is always problematic for white. So rook down to f3, king here to c2, knight to d7, both sides just maneuvering a little bit, trying to get better position in the center of the board. Pawn up here to d4, knight to b6, attacking the pawn. Pawn takes here on a c5. We do see an exchange, so you can see this is what Magnus Carlsen wants. Double pawns on both the c-file and the g-file with no support, so this is going to be good. Knight to c3, king here to e5 in the center of the board. Knight down here to d1. And from here, we actually see a drawn game. Now, it's somewhat weird if you look at this and say, the knight is attacking this square here on c4. Why does the knight come down here to d1 for Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana decides to draw right now? It's going to be tough for either of these sides to really get a victory here. You would have to make a huge mistake. I think both of the sides recognize this. They're already at 41 moves. They haven't spent a ton of energy, haven't gone down any crazy lines where they're getting mentally fatigued. I think both of the players just recognized, hey, let's not get too crazy here. We're the number 1, 2 players in the world. We don't want to have a marathon session of 40, 50 extra moves. So let's just go ahead and call it a day. Now, if it were to continue, maybe the knight takes here on c4. Yes, black has more material, but as we talked about, you don't always count these as full pawns because it's very difficult to really take advantage of both of the pawns. The rook coming up here to h5, attacking this. Depending on where the opponent goes, maybe king comes over here to f5 to hold on to it. Rook up here h7, pawn to c6. Magnus Carlsen has ways to attack back. Rook over here to a7. Can really put pressure on either of these pawns if he wants to take the pawn here or even come back here to c7. So as some options, all in all, this did not play out, but this is how it could have if they continued. So great game from Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana to get this party started. Tata Steel's tournament is going to be going on for a couple weeks, so we will have a ton of games with 14 of the top players in the world going on for a couple weeks. We should have some amazing games. So hope you guys are excited about this tournament. Thank you for tuning in to round 1, and I'll catch you tomorrow for round number 2.